Hello, everyone. I'm Laurel Staples, and today we're talking about federal cuts and how the cuts are bringing a special project on digitizing Indian boarding school records to a halt. Montana Free Press reporter Nora Mabie joins me here via Zoom, and she posted a new story on this, and she's here today to explain the project and the impacts of the cuts. And Nora, it's so good to see you again.
You too.
All right, so let's go ahead. Tell me about the project and the history behind it.
Yeah, so for more than a year, the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, a group that goes by the name NABS, has been working to digitize tens of thousands of pages of Indian boarding school records. And to back up a bit, Indian boarding schools operated from the 1800s to the 1970s. The federal government ran these schools with the goal of assimilating Native children. And children were abused at these schools. They were punished for speaking their languages and for practicing culture. So these records really give us a unique insight into what really went on in these schools, and they show things like correspondence between school leaders and government leaders, or even more personal things like letters between parents and children.
All right, so this is at a halt right now because of funding cuts. Explain that.
Yeah, so NABS sought to digitize more than 100,000 pages of boarding school records. And recently, as part of the Trump administration's effort to cut government spending, the grant that they were using to fund this project was halted. So now about 75,000 pages of records are sitting in online storage systems that cannot be accessed by NABS or by anyone else uh, unless they get more funding to support the cataloging of those records and with the ultimate goal of making them publicly available.
Okay, so talk about in your investigation here with this, what kind of impact is this having out there?
Yeah, so when I spoke with tribal leaders and boarding school survivors and their families, people were really upset by this. The main point that they raise is that having access to these records promotes healing. They argue that to, address issues in the present, you have to understand what happened in the past. And I spoke with Ekoo Beck, who works for NABS. And when their colleagues were cataloging these records, Ikoo asked them to look for their grandmother, Irene Wall, who went to Chemawa in the 1950s. It was a boarding school in Oregon. The NABS team found a bunch of records related to Irene. They found her student identification card, and probably the most impactful was a letter from Irene's father to school officials begging for her to come home. And so Iku said when they saw that letter, it was really emotional just seeing their great grandfather's handwriting, and then just reading, the emotion in his voice when he's really begging for his daughter to be returned.
All right, and talk about some of the other sources that you talked to during this investigation and the response from the other side.
Yeah, so I spoke with other people who, for example, there was a teacher on the Blackfeet reservation, Jake Arrowtopknot, who he uses boarding school records in his classroom a lot. He uses it as a way to have kids learn about their family and their history and sort of create a family tree. And he said it's a way to sort of understand your own identity better. And then without access to the records, he said that that was really hurtful for the class, for the project. And also, people just think there's a sentiment that after enduring this kind of abuse in the boarding schools, to then not have access to family documents, people, there's a sense that it's a grave injustice. And some national boarding school leaders who, are part of these healing efforts have called this really a betrayal, because we've seen recent efforts by, the U.S. Political and also religious leaders trying to reconcile with this history and make public apologies. So people, in this world are now saying that these cuts don't really match up with where they thought we were going.
And this isn't the only project impacted, right? It's other tribes across the nation, right?
Yeah, so this was part of this was funded by a National Endowment for the Humanities grant. And so the Trump administration ended up cutting $1.6 million in NEH grant supported projects that were meant to help boarding school healing initiatives. Some other projects that were impacted, there was one in Alaska that was meant to broadcast and record oral histories from elders. So that project was halted. And then another one, which was meant to create sort of a boarding school exhibit at a museum also in Alaska. So this isn't the only one that was affected. And NABS actually specifically lost 282,000 of their $500,000 National Endowment for the Humanities grant.
Mm. So, what efforts, if any, are underway at this time to try to get this project back on track?
So NABS is looking for more funding and just a different funding source. They basically said, even though they did the work of digitizing a lot of these pages, the big loss was labor. They need to be able to pay for people to catalog that and organize it in a way that can then be made easily accessible for people. So they're looking for different funders. And when I talked to them at NABS, they were optimistic, but as far as I know, still don't have any firm leads on that.
So, what was this story like for you to do? Your big takeaways from this?
I think some big takeaways for me was people really talking about these records as a form of validation, validating their families' experiences in these schools, validating the historical and generational trauma that, has persisted starting in those schools. And then you see it show up in tribal communities today. Um, So, I think Jake Arrowtop, not the teacher on the Blackfeet reservation, he said one of the reasons he likes to teach the reality of what happened at these schools is because he said it much more eloquently than I will, but he said that, a bunch of his students have this collective pain from historical trauma, but they don't really have a monster to place it on. And so he says teaching about boarding schools in some ways can really help people understand and contextualize that pain. And then he said from there, you can really harness it and try to, heal. And it's a way of processing that's perhaps a little different than what's been done before. But that was a big takeaway for me, was just about how important sort of having this primary document can be for people.
You continue to follow this, right? And you've got probably another report coming out.
Yes, yeah, I am sure I will stay on this and track if there's any more projects that will be affected, and I'll be sure to write an update if NABS does get some more funding.
So, Nora, in the meantime, hopefully this will all get resolved. But what's happening during this time?
Yeah, so in the meantime, a bunch of tribes around the country and in Montana are working to record oral histories from elders who survived boarding schools or who had relatives in boarding schools. And so that effort, I'm sure, will continue as it's tribally run. And then we'll see what happens on this digitization effort as well.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'll watch for your next report. Thank you so much, Nora.
Thanks for having me.